I did it with a hammer. My late brother-in-law's hammer, to be precise. With my heart burning with a fury that I, in my blindness, called faith, I shattered the small plaster statue of the Virgin Mary. It was the one thing my newly widowed sister, Helen, was clinging to like a life raft in a storm of grief. I can still hear the sound of my own voice, raw and shrill in her quiet living room, screaming that it was idolatry, a graven image, an offense to the one true God. And I can still see the painted porcelain fragments, like tiny, colorful teardrops, scattering across her floor, mixing with the real tears streaming down her face. That was my act of love. That was my attempt to save my sister's soul. It was the proudest, most righteous, and most destructive moment of my life, and it was the beginning of my end. Or perhaps my true beginning. If this story is already speaking to a place in your heart, if you've ever felt lost, or so certain you were right that you couldn't see the damage you were causing, then I ask you to please subscribe to this channel and like this video. It helps more than you know. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss the rest of my testimony. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Please leave a comment below and tell me your city or state. It's a comfort to know we're not alone in our journeys, no matter how different they may be. My name is Martha. I'm 62 years old now, but the woman who lifted that hammer was a different person, forged in a different fire. I was born and raised right here in central Ohio, in a small town where your church was as much a part of your identity as your last name. For over 40 years, my identity was sealed within the walls of our non-denominational Bible church. It was my world. My faith was the bedrock of my existence, and our pastor, Pastor David, was the architect of its fortress. He was a man of powerful conviction, and even more powerful words. He taught us that the Bible was the only authority, the inerrant and complete Word of God, and that anything added to it, or deviating from it, was a path to damnation. And in his eyes, and therefore in mine, there was no greater deviation than the traditions of the Catholic Church. We didn't just disagree with them. We saw them as a spiritual poison. The rosaries, the confessionals, the saints, and most of all, the veneration of Mary. To us, she was just a woman, a vessel chosen by God, yes, but a human nonetheless. To elevate her, to pray to her, to call her the Queen of Heaven, that was an abomination. We called them plaster saints, empty idols that stole worship from God himself. I wasn't just a passive believer in this doctrine. I was a passionate soldier for it. My faith was my shield and my sword, and I saw idolatry everywhere. A spiritual battle that needed to be fought in our own community, in our own families. My sister, Helen, was my complete opposite. While I was rigid, she was gentle. While I saw the world in black and white, she saw shades of grace. We were raised in the same home, but she had married a kind Catholic man, Frank, and over the years she had drifted back to the faith of her own grandparents. I prayed for her constantly. I argued with her, pleaded with her, sent her pamphlets and Bible verses highlighted in yellow. I saw her faith not as a different path to the same God, but as a dangerous detour into a forest of deception. Our conversations about faith always ended with a wall of frustration between us. I would quote scripture, and she would simply say, "Martha, it's not like that. It's about love." I couldn't understand. In my mind, love and truth were the same thing, and the truth was a narrow, unbending line. When Frank died of a sudden heart attack, Helen's world collapsed. And in her grief, she didn't run to my church or to Pastor David's sermons. She ran to the familiar comforts of her Catholic upbringing. She set up a small memorial in her living room on a little end table. There was a photo of Frank, a candle, and this little plaster statue of Mary, maybe a foot high, with her hands open in a gesture of welcome. To me, that statue wasn't a comfort for my grieving sister. It was a beachhead. It was the enemy planting a flag in her home, in her most vulnerable moment. I saw it as a betrayal of God, a turning to a false idol when she should have been turning only to Him. The breaking point came a few weeks later. I went to her house, my Bible in hand, ready to wage war for her soul. When I walked in, the house was quiet, except for a low murmur from the living room. There, sitting in a small circle of chairs, were Helen and 3 older women from her parish. Their heads were bowed, and in their hands were rosary beads, clicking softly like gentle rain. They were praying, and in the center of their circle, on that end table, was the statue. A righteous, holy anger surged through me. It felt like walking into a temple and seeing the money changers. This, I thought, was not prayer. This was an offense. Blinded by a zeal I was convinced was the Holy Spirit, I walked past them, into the garage, and my eyes fell on Frank's old toolbox. I reached in and pulled out a hammer. It felt heavy and right in my hand. I walked back into the living room. The women looked up, their prayers faltering, their eyes wide with confusion. Helen started to stand, her face a mask of alarm. "Martha, what are you doing?" she whispered. I didn't answer her. I marched straight to that little table, snatched the statue from its place, held it up for them all to see, and with all the strength I had, I brought the hammer down. The crack of the impact echoed in the silent room, a sound of utter finality as the image of the woman they called their mother exploded into 100 pieces on the floor. I stood there, panting, the hammer in my hand, feeling no victory, only a strange, hollow silence. That hollow silence didn't last. It was filled in the space of a single heartbeat by something else, something immense. It wasn't a sound. It was a weight, a pressure, as if the air in the room had suddenly turned to lead. It pressed down on my head, on my shoulders, with an invisible, irresistible force. My breath caught in my chest. I tried to stand straight, to resist, to hold on to the righteous fury that had fueled me just moments before. But it was like trying to stand in a hurricane. My legs began to tremble, then to buckle. It wasn't a dizzy spell. I was perfectly clear-headed. It was a force, a deliberate and overwhelming power that was pushing me down. Helen's friends gasped, scrambling back as if I were about to explode. I saw my sister's face, her mouth open in a silent cry, not of anger, but of sheer terror for me. She reached a hand out, but it was too late. My knees slammed into the hardwood floor with a crack that I felt in my teeth, right into the sharp, scattered remains of the statue. The pain was sharp, immediate. Shards of painted porcelain dug into my kneecaps, but that physical pain was a distant echo compared to the crushing spiritual weight that continued to bear down on me, forcing my torso forward until my hands slapped against the floor to break my fall. And I was left there, on all fours, gasping for air amidst the very idol I had just destroyed. My cheek was pressed against the cold wood, my eyes level with the dust and the glittering debris. The hammer had rolled a few feet away, lying there like a dumb, useless piece of metal. My pride, my certainty, My entire 40-year fortress of faith had crumbled in an instant. I was pinned to the ground not by a physical person, but by a presence so profound, so absolute, that it left no room for argument or doubt. I tried to pray. In the panic of that moment, I tried to call out to the God I had served my whole life. I searched my mind for a psalm, for a verse of comfort, for the name of Jesus that had always been my shield. But there was nothing. My mind was a barren wasteland. The scriptures I had memorized, the sermons I had cherished, the hymns I had sung with all my heart, they were all gone. It was a silence more terrifying than any condemnation. The God I thought I knew, the God of judgment and wrath who I believed was on my side, was nowhere to be found. Or worse, perhaps he was there, and this was his answer, this crushing, humiliating silence. I could hear quiet shuffling, the whisper of fabric, and the click of a door closing. The other women had left. I don't blame them. What they had just witnessed was not a simple family argument. It was a spiritual unraveling, a violent act followed by a bizarre collapse. Soon there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing and Helen's soft, broken sobs. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, pinned down by my shame and this inexplicable force. Finally, the pressure began to recede, not all at once, but slowly, like a tide going out, leaving me beached and broken on the shore of my sister's living room floor. I pushed myself up, my knees screaming in protest. Blood was seeping through my slacks from a dozen tiny cuts. I looked at my hands, trembling and covered in dust. Then I looked at Helen. She wasn't looking at me with hatred. It was worse. She was looking at me with a pity so deep it felt like a physical blow. She had seen my pride, and now she was seeing my utter demolition. She didn't say a word. She just knelt, carefully picking up the largest pieces of the broken statue, her movements gentle, as if she were gathering the bones of a beloved friend. The rejection I had always feared from God, I was now receiving in the form of my sister's sorrowful silence. I had come to her house as a warrior, a rescuer, and now I was the one in ruins. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and a deepening dread. I went home, cleaned my wounds, and tried to resume my life. I went to church that Sunday, sitting in my usual pew. I listened to Pastor David preach about standing firm against the deceptions of the world, and for the first time, his words felt hollow, like echoes in an empty cavern. I tried to sing, but the words felt like lies in my mouth. My faith, which had been my rock, was now just a pile of sand, and I was sinking. The silence from God continued. My prayers felt like they were hitting a brass ceiling and falling back down on me as dust. I was completely, terrifyingly alone. The fear began to creep in, a cold and insidious thing. It wasn't just fear of what I had done, but a fear of what I had become. What if my entire life had been a mistake? What if the faith I had wielded like a weapon was in fact a counterfeit? The thought was a chasm opening up beneath me, threatening to swallow me whole. The silence in that room, after the hammer fell, was the beginning of a silence in my soul that would lead me to the brink of despair. If you've ever felt that kind of silence, that feeling of being completely cut off from everything you believed in, please, let this story be a comfort to you. Hit that like button if you want to know what happened in the silence, and make sure you're subscribed with all notifications turned on, because the voice that finally broke it was not the one I was expecting. The cuts on my knees eventually scabbed over. I cleaned them with peroxide and covered them with bandages. a simple physical task that felt worlds away from the real damage. The wound in my soul, however, just kept bleeding. I spent the next week in a self-imposed prison of silence and shame. The house felt cavernous, every tick of the clock a judgment. I tried to read my Bible, but the words were just black marks on a page. They were the same verses I had once used as stones to throw at others, and now they felt like they were piled on my own chest, crushing the breath out of me. The God I had built in my own image, a God of rigid rules and swift punishment, had abandoned me. Or I had abandoned him. I wasn't sure which was worse. I was adrift in a spiritual wasteland of my own making, and I was dying of thirst. The nights were the hardest. Sleep offered no escape, only a restless tossing in a bed that felt too big, too empty. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, replaying the sound of that hammer, the sight of my sister's face. I was haunted. One night, about a week after the incident, I couldn't bear to be in the bedroom any longer. I went downstairs and sat in my old armchair in the living room, not even bothering to turn on a light. The darkness outside matched the darkness inside me. I finally did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I stopped trying to pray with words. I stopped quoting scripture in my head. I just sat there, a broken woman in a dark room, and I let the silence have me. And in the deepest part of that silence, in the absolute pit of my despair, I whispered into the darkness, "I don't know who you are, but if anyone is there, I am sorry." And that's when it happened. It started not with a sight or a sound, but with a scent. The unmistakable, impossible fragrance of fresh roses. It wasn't a faint perfume like from a candle or an air freshener. This was rich and deep and alive. It was as if 1,000 rose bushes had bloomed in my sealed living room in the dead of winter. My eyes shot open, scanning the darkness. My heart began to pound. My logical mind, the part of me that had always demanded proof and rejected mystery, was screaming for an explanation. The window was closed. My neighbors didn't have rose bushes. It was a cold November night. There was no earthly reason for this. The scent grew stronger, more pervasive, until it felt like I was breathing it in, like it was filling my very lungs, cleansing the stale air of my despair. Then came the presence. It was as real as the chair I was sitting on, yet entirely unseen. It wasn't a frightening presence. There was no judgment in it, no, "I told you so." It was a wave of tenderness. That's the only word for it. A vast, profound, maternal tenderness that washed over me, through me, around me. I felt known. Every ugly, prideful, hateful corner of my soul was laid bare before this presence. And yet, it didn't recoil. It leaned in closer. There was no voice, but a message was communicated directly to my heart, clearer than any spoken word. You are loved. You are not lost. You are mine. The God of my old faith would have condemned me, would have demanded penance, would have pointed out my sin. This presence didn't ignore my sin. It simply loved me through it. It didn't point a finger. It felt like it was opening its arms. I began to weep. Not the angry, frustrated tears I was used to, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs of a child who has been found after being lost in the woods. The tears that came weren't for myself, for my loneliness, or my pain. They were tears of profound shame because I finally saw the ugliness of my pride reflected in the mirror of this perfect, unconditional love. I saw what I had done to my sister, what I had done to myself, what I had done in the name of a God I never truly knew. And in that moment of absolute brokenness, cradled in a scent of roses and a feeling of pure mercy, I finally understood. My fall in Helen's living room wasn't a punishment. It was an invitation. It was an act of grace, forcing me to my knees so I could finally look up. My logical mind still tried to fight. A hallucination brought on by stress, grief, a trick of the senses. But my heart, the part of me that had been starving for 40 years, knew better. This was more real than the floor beneath my feet. This was the truth I had been searching for by wielding a hammer. Just as the scent of roses began to gently fade, the silence of the house was broken by a sharp, sudden sound. The doorbell. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. My blood ran cold. Who could possibly be at my door? I froze, my hand over my mouth, my tears still wet on my cheeks. It rang again, a patient, persistent chime. With trembling legs, I got up and walked to the door, peering through the peephole, and my heart stopped. It was Helen. I opened the door slowly. She stood on my porch, under the dim yellow light, holding 2 grocery bags. Her face was tired, etched with her own grief, but her eyes held no anger. They held the same impossible tenderness I had just felt in the living room. We just stood there for a moment, the cold night air between us. I couldn't speak. Finally, I managed a choked whisper. "Helen, I'm so sorry." She didn't say, "It's okay." She didn't say, "I forgive you." She just looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "I know, Martha. I was worried about you. You haven't been answering your phone." And she stepped inside past me and put the groceries on my kitchen counter. Milk, bread, soup. An act of simple, profound, sisterly love. That night, Grace had a name, and it was Helen. That moment on my doorstep wasn't the end of the story. It was page 1 of a book I never knew I was meant to read. If you want to hear how I began to learn what faith really looks like, what love truly is, then please give this video a like and make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Helen left that night, and the silence that returned to my house was different. It was no longer the empty, accusing silence of a God who had turned his back. It was a contemplative quiet, filled with the ghost of roses and the echo of an impossible tenderness. But in the harsh light of morning, my mind, the fortress I'd spent a lifetime building, went to work immediately. It began constructing defenses, explanations, rationalizations. It was a phantom smell, a synesthetic response to extreme emotional distress, a hallucination. The brain is a powerful organ, it told me, and in moments of crisis, it can create sensory experiences to protect itself. The feeling of a presence, that was just my mind, starved for comfort, manufacturing a feeling of peace to pull me back from the brink. Coincidence that Helen showed up at that exact moment? She said she'd been calling. I hadn't heard the phone. It was all logical. It was all explainable. I could package it up, label it psychological event, and put it on a shelf. But I couldn't, because the memory of it was more real than the coffee cup in my hand. The feeling of being known, of being seen in my ugliest moment, and not being rejected, but embraced. That wasn't a product of my own mind. My mind was incapable of that kind of grace. My mind knew only judgment, rules, and condemnation. I had spent 40 years programming it that way. This was something entirely other. It was an invasion of mercy into a territory I had sealed off. The war began then, not against my sister or the Catholic Church, but inside my own head. My old faith, with its clear lines and rigid doctrines, was a well-armed garrison, shouting arguments from the battlements. It's a deception, a trick of the enemy to lead you astray. But this new experience, this quiet, fragrant memory, wasn't fighting back with arguments. It was just there. A silent, unmovable truth planted in the center of the battlefield. The scent of roses came back, not in a great wave like that first night, but in small, fleeting whispers. I'd be driving, my mind churning over what to do, and for just a second, the air in the car would be sweet with it. I'd be in the grocery store staring blankly at the shelves, and it would drift past me. Each time my heart would leap, and the logical fortress in my mind would crumble a little more. These moments were a gentle, persistent reminder, a tether back to that night on my living room floor, proving it wasn't a dream. And with every reminder, the shame grew. It was a physical thing, a hot flush that started in my chest and spread to my face. I would remember things I hadn't thought of in years. I remembered a potluck at my own church, maybe 10 years ago, where I told a cruel joke about the Pope that had everyone laughing. I remembered seeing a neighbor in her yard, praying with a rosary, and muttering under my breath, "Poor deluded woman." I remembered every pamphlet I'd ever smugly handed out, every Bible verse I had weaponized, every conversation with Helen where I refused to listen. So certain was I of my own righteousness. I saw myself, truly saw myself for the first time, not as a soldier for God, but as a bully, a loud, proud, spiritual bully who had used her faith as a club. And the presence that had met me in my living room hadn't held any of that against me. How could a love so pure even look upon a heart as ugly as mine without turning away in disgust? This internal battle is one of the hardest things I've ever endured. And if you've ever felt that kind of war inside your own heart, you know how lonely it can be. Hitting that like button and the notification bell lets me know you're still here with me on this journey. And I am so grateful for that. I couldn't go back. I knew I could never again sit in my pew at Pastor David's church and hear him preach against the very things that were now the source of this baffling grace in my life. The God he spoke of was not the one who had met me on the floor. I was spiritually homeless, adrift. But I was no longer adrift in a void. There was a light, faint and mysterious, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that I had to move toward it. The thought was terrifying. It felt like a betrayal of everything I had ever believed, but staying where I was felt like a betrayal of the truth. So one Tuesday afternoon, I found myself driving through a part of town I usually avoided. I parked my car across the street from St. Michael's, Helen's church. It was a beautiful old stone building, intimidating and foreign. For 20 minutes, I just sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My mind was screaming at me. "What are you doing? This is the enemy's house. They worship statues in there." But the memory of the roses was stronger than the fear. Finally, I took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked across the street. The heavy wooden doors looked 1,000 feet tall. My hand trembled as I reached for the cold, ornate metal handle. This was it. This was the threshold I had spent my entire life condemning others for crossing. I pulled the door open. It was heavier than I expected, and it groaned as it swung inward, announcing my intrusion into the sacred silence. I slipped inside, letting the door click shut behind me, and my breath caught in my throat. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, candle wax and a faint, sweet hint of incense. It was nothing like my church, which was bright, modern, and plain. This place felt ancient. Light filtered through enormous stained glass windows, painting the rows of empty pews in shifting jewels of blue and red and gold. It was dim and quiet and beautiful. My eyes were drawn upward, to the high vaulted ceiling that seemed to disappear into the shadows. My whole life I had called places like this gaudy, idolatrous, a distraction from true worship. But standing there, alone in the silence, all I felt was a profound sense of peace. And a profound sense of smallness. My gaze fell upon the statues that lined the walls, standing silent in their alcoves. My old self recoiled, the word idol flashing in my mind. But I forced myself to look. I saw figures I vaguely recognized. A man holding keys, another with arrows. Then, in a side chapel, illuminated by a bank of flickering votive candles, I saw her. A statue of Mary, larger than the one I had destroyed, but with the same gentle face, the same hands open in a gesture of welcome. I felt a magnetic pull. My feet began to move, seemingly of their own accord, down the long aisle, my soft footsteps echoing in the vast space. I stopped a few feet from the statue, my heart in my throat. The candlelight danced on her painted face, making her look almost alive, her expression one of sorrowful compassion. And in that moment, standing before the very symbol of everything I had hated and mocked, the dam inside me broke. The pride, the certainty, the 40 years of being right. It all washed away in a silent, scalding flood of tears. I didn't kneel. I didn't speak. I just stood there and wept, letting the ugliness and the shame pour out of me in the quiet, holy darkness of that unfamiliar church. I had come in as a spy, an intruder. But in the shadow of that statue, for the first time in my life, I felt like I might finally be home. Word of my change didn't spread like a wildfire. It was more like smoke, seeping under doors and through cracks in the walls of the community I had called home for 40 years. It started with my absence from church. Then someone saw my car parked outside St. Michael's. Another saw me walking in the church garden with Helen. The whispers started, then the phone calls. At first, they were concerned. Friends from my old Bible study group would call, their voices laced with a nervous sort of kindness. "Martha, we've been praying for you. We heard you're going through something. Are you all right?" But when I tried to explain, when I spoke of the scent of roses and the feeling of a presence that was nothing but love, their kindness curdled into alarm. The narrative was quickly decided for me. I was grieving. I was vulnerable. I had suffered a breakdown. Pastor David himself called me. He didn't yell. His voice was calm, pastoral, the voice of a shepherd trying to guide a lost sheep. He told me that the enemy is a deceiver, that he comes as an angel of light, that he uses our emotions and our pain to lead us astray with false signs and wonders. "Martha," he said, his voice heavy with paternal disappointment, "you're playing with fire. These feelings, these experiences, they are not from God. They are a trap." The old me would have argued. I would have pulled out my Bible, quoted verses back at him, and engaged in a theological war. But I couldn't. All I could say, my voice quiet but firm, was, "David, I appreciate your concern." But what I felt, it was the most real thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I had rejected his rescue. To him, and to everyone else in my old life, I was no longer just lost. I was defiant. The phone call stopped. When I'd see old friends at the grocery store, they'd give me a tight, sad smile and hurry down another aisle. I was an outcast, a cautionary tale. They believed they were protecting themselves from my delusion, but their rejection felt like a gentle rain compared to the storm I had lived in before. I wasn't angry with them. How could I be? I was looking at a reflection of myself just a few months prior. I simply prayed for them, a prayer that was no longer about being right, but about them one day feeling the same mercy that had found me. While one door closed, another began to open, creaking with my own hesitation. Helen was my guide. She never pushed. She just invited. She'd ask if I wanted to come with her to put flowers on Frank's grave, and afterward, we'd stop into the church to light a candle. She invited me to a parish potluck in the church basement. I was terrified, certain I'd be met with suspicion and judgment. The women from the Rosary group were there. I expected them to stare, to whisper about the crazy woman with the hammer. But when I walked in, one of them, a kind woman named Maria, came right up to me, took my hands in hers and said, "We are so happy you are here." No judgment, no questions, just welcome. I started attending Mass with Helen, sitting in the back pew, feeling like a foreigner. I didn't understand everything, the standing, the kneeling, the responses. But I listened, and I watched, and I began to see. I saw the love people had for the Eucharist. I saw the comfort they found in the sacrament of reconciliation. The symbols I had once called empty idols, I now saw as doorways. The statue of Mary wasn't a goddess they were worshipping. She was a mother, a constant, tangible reminder of a love that says yes to God, a love that points the way to her Son. My real turning point, the moment I truly crossed the threshold, came a few months later at the parish's annual testimony night. It was an evening where people could share stories of their faith. Helen had been asked to speak about her experience after Frank's death. She looked at me and said, "I think you have a story to tell too." My blood ran cold. To stand up in front of all these people, the very people whose faith I had mocked and attacked, and tell them the truth. It felt impossible, but the memory of the roses, of that all-encompassing mercy, gave me a strength that was not my own. When my turn came, I walked to the podium, my knees trembling just as they had on Helen's floor. The room was full. I saw Maria's smiling face, and Helen sitting in the front row, giving me a small, encouraging nod. I took a deep breath. "My name is Martha," I began, my voice shaking. "And for over 40 years I hated this church. I hated your traditions. I hated your statues. I believed with all my heart that you were lost and that I was saved." A nervous hush fell over the room. Many of you know my sister, Helen. When her husband Frank passed in her grief, she turned to the comfort of her faith, and I saw it as an abomination. I had to pause, my throat tight with emotion. I saw a small statue of Mary in her home, and I took a hammer, and I smashed it to pieces on her living room floor, in front of her friends. A collective gasp went through the room. I could feel their shock, their horror. I didn't look at them. I looked at Helen, whose eyes were now filled with tears, not of pain, but of love. "I did it in the name of God," I continued, my voice breaking. "But the God I thought I was serving the god of my anger and my pride. He wasn't there. In that moment of my greatest, most hateful act of righteousness, I was met with a force I cannot explain, a power that brought me to my knees. And on that floor, amidst the pieces of what I had destroyed, I was shown a mercy I had never known, a love that didn't condemn me, but held me, and it came with the scent of roses. I looked out at the sea of faces, and I saw not anger, but compassion. I stand here tonight to say I am sorry. I am so profoundly sorry for the judgment in my heart, for the pride that blinded me. I learned that night that you cannot break what is holy. You can only break yourself against it. The very thing I tried to destroy, the symbol of the mother I rejected, that was the beginning of my salvation. She didn't point a finger at me. She pointed me back to her son, to a love that is bigger than our doctrines, wider than the walls of our churches, and deeper than our gravest sins. I didn't just change my mind. I had my heart broken open, so that God could finally rebuild it. I finished, weeping openly, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, someone began to clap, then another, and another, until the entire room was on its feet, their applause washing over me, not as praise, but as acceptance, as grace. My journey is far from over. I am still learning. I am still a broken woman, but now I know where to take the pieces. My story isn't about which church is right. It's about how a heart, made of stone by pride and certainty, can be turned to flesh by a love that refuses to give up on us. If my story has touched a place in your own heart, if you've ever felt lost in your own certainty, or found in a moment of utter brokenness, please, let me know in the comments below. Your faith and your stories give strength to us all. And if you want to continue on this journey with me, please like this video, and be sure to subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because every one of us has a story of a hammer and a rose, and we need to hear them. Thank you for listening.